Margaret stood frozen in the laundry room, a crisp white shirt trembling in her hands. The faint smear of crimson lipstick on the collar stared back at her like a mocking smile. Her breath hitched, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't worn lipstick in months, and even if she had, this bold, fiery red wasn't her color. She tried to reason with herself. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe it was an accident, a smudge from someone brushing against him. But deep down, Margaret knew better. Her hands trembled as she shoved the shirt to the bottom of the laundry basket, willing herself to keep calm. It was unlike Edward to be careless. He was meticulous in every aspect of his life, his appearance, his career, and the carefully curated image of their family. They had been married for 15 years, and for most of those years, Margaret believed in their love story. To their suburban community, Margaret and Edward were the perfect couple. At 40-year-old son, Margaret embodied poise and grace, the quintessential supportive wife who had sacrificed her career to focus on raising their 2 children. Daniel, their 12-year-old son, was bright and responsible, while 5-year-old Lily was the light of their lives, a bundle of joy who never failed to bring a smile to her parents' faces. Edward, at 42-year-old son, was the charismatic head of the family. A successful businessman, he had climbed the corporate ladder with charm and determination, earning the admiration of his peers. At social events, he was the center of attention, flashing his winning smile and cracking jokes that left people laughing and nodding in agreement. Margaret had always stood quietly by his side, the perfect complement to his outgoing personality. She kept the household running smoothly, ensured their children excelled, and managed the countless small details that made their life seem effortless. But lately, the effort felt one-sided. Edward has changed over the past few years. His late nights at the office became more frequent, his excuses for missed family dinners flimsier. He spent more time glued to his phone, smiling at messages she never saw. Margaret told herself it was stress, that Edward was simply busy expanding his business. But the lipstick stain felt like a tipping point, a tangible, undeniable sign that something was deeply wrong. The following week, Margaret found herself tidying Edward's study while the children were at school. His briefcase sat open on his desk, and she hesitated before peeking inside. Nestled among the documents was a folded hotel receipt. Her heart sank as she unfolded the paper. It was for a boutique in about an hour away, dated during one of Edward's business trips. The receipt listed a luxury suite for 2, complete with champagne service. Margaret sank into the chair, gripping the receipt tightly. Her worst fears were becoming reality. That evening, Margaret watched Edward across the dinner table. He laughed with Daniel about school and helped Lily cut her vegetables, his demeanor warm and affectionate. To an outsider, he was the perfect father, but Margaret couldn't unsee the evidence of his betrayal. Her devastation deepened a few days later, during an innocuous conversation with a neighbor, Claire. The two were chatting in the garden when Claire brought up Amelia, the young woman who had moved into the neighborhood 4 years ago. "That Amelia is doing so well with little Emily," Claire remarked. "Such a sweet girl. Funny, though, don't you think she has Edward's eyes?" Margaret's blood ran cold. "I hadn't noticed," she managed to say, forcing a smile. "Oh, yes," Claire continued cheerfully. "She's 3 now. Amelia's done a great job raising her on her own." Later that evening, Margaret sat alone in the living room, piecing together the full picture. Edward wasn't just having an affair. Amelia's 3-year-old daughter, Emily, was his. That night, as Edward slept soundly beside her, Margaret stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She couldn't let this betrayal go unanswered. If Edward thought he could destroy her life and walk away unscathed, he was wrong. For the first time, Margaret's thoughts turned to revenge. Not the fleeting, dramatic fantasies of a scorned wife, but cold, calculated justice. Edward had broken their marriage, and she would make him pay for every lie he had told. Edward's betrayal was unforgivable. He hadn't just broken his vows, he had built an entirely separate life, a family with Amelia and their daughter, Emily. Margaret's mind replayed Claire's words over and over, each repetition feeling like a fresh wound. She's 3 now. Don't you think she has Edward's eyes? The depth of the deception was staggering. Edward had smiled at her, laughed with their children, and played the role of the devoted husband, all while sneaking away to Amelia's apartment to cradle another child in his arms. At first, Margaret had contemplated divorce. It seemed like the logical choice. But as she explored the ramifications, the reality became painfully clear. Edward was powerful, both financially and socially. His spotless reputation, bolstered by years of careful cultivation, would make him an overwhelming opponent in court. Her lawyer's words echoed in her mind, given his income and public standing, it's likely he'll push for custody of the children, and win. Judges often favor stability, and as a business owner, he can paint himself as the provider, while your role as a homemaker may be seen as dependent. The thought of losing Daniel and Lily was unbearable. They were her world, the one part of her life that still felt pure. Divorce would hand Edward everything, his business, his lover, and even their children. Margaret would be left with nothing but the ashes of a life she had devoted herself to building. The injustice of it consumed her. How could someone like Edward, who had lied, cheated, and betrayed, walk away unscathed? How could he continue his charade as the doting father and upstanding businessman while leaving her broken? Margaret's anger simmered into something colder, sharper. Divorce wasn't justice, it was surrender. And she wasn't about to let Edward win. If divorce wasn't an option, there had to be another way. By morning, Margaret had made her decision. Edward would die. Margaret knew she had to be careful. This wasn't about impulsive revenge, it was about precision. If Edward's death aroused suspicion, everything would fall apart. She would lose Daniel and Lily and end up in prison, while Edward's legacy would remain untarnished. No, her plan had to be flawless. His death needed to appear natural, leaving no trail that could lead back to her. She began her research methodically, under the guise of curiosity. At first, she read about common causes of sudden death, heart attacks, strokes, and aneurysms. But as she delved deeper, she found herself exploring darker corners of the internet. Forums and articles on poisons, undetectable toxins, and slow-acting substances that mimic natural illnesses. After weeks of careful study, Margaret found what she was looking for, a substance that caused gradual fatigue, nausea, and eventual organ failure. In small doses, it would appear as though Edward were succumbing to stress or an undiagnosed condition. The toxin was difficult to trace, especially if administered over time, and would mimic a natural death if handled correctly. Margaret's heart pounded as she made her first purchase, a seemingly innocuous gardening supply that contained the compound she needed. She paid in cash and used an out-of-town store, leaving no record of the transaction. Margaret began rehearsing her actions in her mind, planning every detail with cold precision. The toxin would be introduced gradually, mixed into Edward's tea or sprinkled into his food. She would play the role of the concerned wife, encouraging him to see a doctor when his health started to decline, ensuring no one suspected foul play. Her hands trembled the first time she added a tiny amount to Edward's tea. She stirred it carefully, watching the powder dissolve before setting the cup on the table. Edward glanced up from his phone, offering her a distracted smile as he sipped. "How's your day been?" he asked, his tone casual. Margaret returned the smile, her voice steady. "Busy as always." "You?" "Same old," he replied, scrolling through his messages. Margaret nodded, her expression calm, but inside, her heart raced. This was just the beginning. Edward didn't notice the change at first, but Margaret did. Over the next few weeks, he began to complain of fatigue, occasional nausea, and a general sense of unease. He chalked it up to stress, promising to get more rest and take better care of himself. Margaret encouraged him, hiding her satisfaction behind a mask of concern. Her plan was working, and with each passing day, Edward's health declined further. This was justice, Margaret thought as she watched him sip his poison tea. Not the kind handed out by courts or lawyers, but the kind delivered by a wife scorned. Edward's decline was steady and predictable, just as Margaret had planned. Over the weeks, his once robust energy faded. He complained of persistent fatigue and occasional nausea, attributing it to the mounting stress of work. Margaret played her role flawlessly, her expressions of concern so genuine that even Edward seemed touched. "You really should see a doctor," she would say softly, hiding the satisfaction behind her words. But Edward, ever the self-assured man, dismissed her worries. "I'll be fine, Margaret. Just need to rest." Rest wouldn't save him. Meanwhile, Margaret's days were filled with the familiar routine of motherhood. She ensured Daniel stayed on top of his schoolwork and soccer practice, while Lily, ever the curious and playful child, occupied herself with toys and drawing. Margaret worked tirelessly to keep the children shielded from the growing tension between her and Edward. But underneath her calm facade, Margaret was crumbling. The weight of her plan consumed her every thought. She checked and rechecked the doses she added to Edward's food and drink, constantly recalculating to ensure his decline wouldn't draw suspicion. The once meticulous woman began to make mistakes, small oversights that she convinced herself were insignificant. One of those mistakes would shatter her world. It was a warm afternoon when the accident happened. Margaret had been busy in the kitchen, preparing snacks for Lily, who was playing in her parents' bedroom, a habit Margaret usually discouraged but allowed that day in a lapse of attention. As Lily wandered the room, her curious eyes caught sight of something bright and colorful on Margaret's dresser. It was a small bottle, tucked behind a picture frame, its vivid label and shiny cap inviting her to investigate. The poison. Margaret had grown careless, leaving the bottle out after the last time she had mixed it into Edward's tea. To Lily, it looked no different than her mother's perfumes or the colorful juice bottles she sometimes drank from. She twisted the cap with tiny, determined hands and took a sip. The effects were almost immediate. Lily's small body convulsed as the toxin raced through her system. She collapsed to the floor, the bottle rolling out of her grasp. Margaret heard the thud from the kitchen and rushed upstairs, her heart leaping into her throat. "Lily," she called, her voice edged with panic. She found her daughter lying on the carpet, her tiny frame lifeless and still. The bottle was there, its garish label now a horrifying mockery of her carelessness. "Lily!" Margaret screamed, dropping to her knees. She scooped the girl into her arms, frantically shaking her, hoping for a response. "No, no, no." With trembling hands, she called an ambulance, her voice barely coherent as she begged them to hurry. "She's not breathing, please, I don't know what happened." But deep down, she knew. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but to Margaret, it felt like an eternity. She hovered nearby as they checked Lily, praying desperately for a miracle. One of the medics finally turned to her, his expression grave. "I'm sorry. She's gone." Margaret's legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the floor, her sobs tearing through the quiet room. She cradled Lily's lifeless body, rocking her back and forth, as if she could will her daughter back to life. The hours that followed were a blur. The paramedics left, taking Lily's small body to the coroner. Margaret remained in the bedroom, staring at the spot where her daughter had fallen. The grief was unbearable, but something darker began to take hold. As the shock faded, it was replaced by a seething rage. This wasn't just an accident. This was the culmination of everything Edward and Amelia had done to destroy her family. If Edward hadn't betrayed her, if Amelia hadn't seduced him, none of this would have happened. Margaret's life had been perfect before they poisoned it with their lies and deceit. And now, they had taken the one thing she could never replace. Her innocent little Lily. Margaret clenched her fists, her grief twisting into a single, focused thought. Amelia. Amelia had to pay. She was the root of all of this, the reason Edward strayed, the reason Margaret had been driven to such desperate measures. Her tears dried as her sorrow hardened into resolve. Margaret's vision blurred with anger as she stormed downstairs. In the kitchen, her hand hovered over the drawer where she kept the knives. She hesitated only for a moment before pulling out the largest blade, its edge glinting in the dim light. Clutching the knife tightly, Margaret's mind raced with images of Amelia. Her smile, her flirtatious demeanor, her child with Edward, a child who had survived while Lily lay dead. The unfairness of it all burned in Margaret's chest, fueling her every step as she walked out the door and into the night. She would make Amelia understand the pain of losing everything. Margaret's footsteps were heavy as she marched down the quiet suburban street, clutching the knife in her trembling hand. The cool evening air bit at her skin, but she didn't feel it. Her mind was consumed by a single thought: Amelia had to pay. The soft glow of lights spilling from Amelia's living room windows guided Margaret forward. From the street, she could see the cozy interior, a stark contrast to the cold rage that burned inside her. Margaret paused outside the door, her breath shallow, her grip on the knife tightening. With a trembling hand, she rang the doorbell. Moments later, the door opened to reveal Amelia. Her youthful face, framed by loose curls, was painted with mild surprise. "Margaret," she said, her tone uncertain. "What are you doing here?" For a moment, Margaret didn't answer. She stood there, her chest heaving, her emotions threatening to spill over. Finally, she stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "Margaret, is everything," Amelia began, but the words died in her throat as she noticed the knife glinting in Margaret's hand. "You destroyed my family," Margaret hissed, her voice trembling with fury. Amelia's brows knitted together in confusion, then alarm. "What are you talking about?" "Margaret, put the knife down. Let's talk about this." Margaret laughed bitterly, a sound that sent a chill through the room. "Talk? Like you talked to my husband? Like you talked to him while he made a mockery of our marriage? While you gave him a child and let him ruin everything?" Amelia's eyes darted toward the living room, where Emily, her 3-year-old daughter with Edward, was playing with a stuffed animal. "Margaret, please, let's go outside. Emily is here. She doesn't need to see this." But Margaret's gaze flicked toward the little girl, and the sight only fueled her anger. Emily's resemblance to Edward was undeniable. Her dark eyes and cheeky smile were cruel reminders of everything Margaret had lost. "You don't get to protect her," Margaret snapped, her voice rising. "You don't get to live happily ever after while my daughter is dead." Amelia's face paled. What happened to Lily?" "She's dead," Margaret shouted, her voice cracking. "Because of you. Because of him. You took everything from me." Amelia raised her hands, her voice desperate. "Margaret, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted." "Liar." Margaret lunged forward, the knife trembling in her hand. Amelia stumbled back, her movements panicked and clumsy. "Margaret, stop. Think about your children, think about Daniel." But Margaret was past reason. Her grief, anger, and heartbreak boiled over in a single, uncontrollable moment. With a scream, she thrust the knife forward, the blade sinking into Amelia's side. Amelia cried out in pain, her hands instinctively reaching for the wound. "No, please," she gasped, stumbling backward. But Margaret didn't stop. Each stab was driven by a fresh wave of fury, her mind flashing with images of Lily, lifeless on the floor, and Edward, smiling as if nothing had happened. When Margaret finally stepped back, Amelia collapsed to the ground, her body lifeless, surrounded by a growing pool of blood. The knife slipped from Margaret's hand, clattering onto the hardwood floor. She stared down at Amelia's body, her chest heaving, her hands trembling and slick with blood. The rage that had driven her moments ago began to fade, replaced by a hollow emptiness. She stumbled backward and sank onto the couch, her hands covering her face. "What have I done?" she whispered, her voice breaking. The room was eerily silent, save for the soft sounds of Emily's sobs. Margaret looked up to see the little girl standing in the doorway, clutching her stuffed animal, her wide eyes fixed on her mother's lifeless body. Emily's cries grew louder, piercing the stillness of the house. Margaret's stomach churned as the weight of her actions began to sink in. She had killed Amelia. She had killed the mother of this innocent child. Margaret pressed her palms against her temples, trying to block out Emily's screams. But they only grew louder, echoing in her ears and mingling with the haunting memory of Lily's laughter. For the first time, Margaret felt the full weight of her grief, not just for Lily, but for everything she had lost and everything she had destroyed. Edward pulled into Amelia's driveway, his mind racing with thoughts of what he might say to her. Their affair had grown increasingly strained in recent weeks, and her messages earlier in the day hinted at frustration and a demand to talk. The house was dark, except for a single light glowing from the living room window. He knocked once, then twice. No answer. Unease settled in his chest as he twisted the doorknob and found it unlocked. "Amelia," he called out, stepping inside. The smell of blood hit him first, a metallic tang that made his stomach churn. His eyes fell on the scene before him, Amelia lying motionless on the floor, her body surrounded by a dark pool of blood. Emily, their 3-year-old daughter, was sitting near her mother, clutching a stuffed animal and crying uncontrollably. On the couch sat Margaret, her head in her hands, her clothes and hands stained with blood. She didn't move, didn't look up, as Edward stood frozen in the doorway. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What did you do?" Slowly, Margaret raised her head, her eyes hollow and red-rimmed. "I did what you deserved," she said, her voice low and broken. "She took everything from me, Edward. Everything." Edward's chest tightened as he tried to make sense of the carnage before him. His mind raced with questions, accusations, and fear. But one fact stood out above all else: Margaret had killed Amelia. "Emily," he said, his voice shaking as he crouched to pick up the crying child. She clung to him tightly, her sobs muffled against his chest. He turned back to Margaret, his face pale with shock. You did this in front of her?" Margaret's gaze flickered to Emily, then back to Edward. "She still has you," she murmured. "More than Lily has now." The weight of her words struck Edward like a blow. "What are you talking about? What happened to Lily?" Margaret's face crumpled as tears streamed down her cheeks. "She's gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Because of the poison I made for you." The room seemed to tilt as Edward tried to process her confession. The enormity of what Margaret had done, killing Amelia, poisoning him, and accidentally causing Lily's death, washed over him in a wave of horror. Edward pulled out his phone with trembling hands and dialed 911. "There's been a murder," he said, his voice raw. 2, maybe more. "Please, send the police. It's urgent." The police arrived within minutes. Officers flooded the scene, securing the apartment, assessing the bloodied room, and taking Emily into protective care. Margaret didn't resist as they handcuffed her and led her to the patrol car, her expression one of vacant resignation. Edward gave his statement in a daze, recounting how he had arrived to find Amelia dead, Emily crying, and Margaret confessing to both the murder and Lily's accidental poisoning. As the officers pieced together the evidence, they uncovered the brightly colored bottle of poison in Margaret's home. The story began to unravel: Margaret's carefully calculated plan to poison Edward, the tragic accident that took Lily's life, and the rage that drove her to confront and kill Amelia. The courtroom was packed as Margaret stood trial for the murders of Amelia and Lily. The media had turned the story into a scandal, painting Margaret as a vengeful wife consumed by jealousy and grief. Edward testified, his guilt evident as he recounted his affair with Amelia, the birth of their daughter Emily, and his obliviousness to Margaret's unraveling. While he admitted to his infidelity, the court focused on Margaret's actions, the poison, the murder, and the collateral damage of her revenge. Margaret's lawyer argued that her actions were driven by emotional trauma and a desperate need for justice, but the evidence was damning. The jury deliberated for less than a day before delivering their verdict, guilty on all counts. Margaret was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Edward stood outside the courthouse, holding Emily in his arms as reporters bombarded him with questions. His once admired reputation was in tatters, his business dealings under scrutiny, and his personal life laid bare for the world to see. Daniel, now without a mother or a sister, refused to speak to Edward. The boy moved in with his maternal grandparents, leaving Edward to care for Emily alone. Every night, Edward sat in the silence of his now empty home, grappling with the weight of his choices. His affair with Amelia had set off a chain reaction of destruction, leaving 2 women dead, 1 child lost, and another traumatized. Emily, too young to understand the full extent of what had happened, often asked for her mother. Edward could never find the words to explain why she wasn't coming back. Though Edward had escaped the legal consequences of Margaret's actions, he couldn't escape the guilt. He carried the burden of knowing that his betrayal had destroyed 2 families and taken innocent lives. In the end, there were no winners, only survivors left to piece together what remained of their shattered lives.